Daniel had always been the kind of person who preferred the company of trees over people. There was something about the deep quiet of a forest that felt like medicine to him, a clean, uncomplicated silence that the rest of the world never seemed to offer. So, on a cool October afternoon 3 years ago, he drove out to a trail he had never hiked before. It was further from the main park entrance than most, marked by a worn wooden sign half swallowed by overgrown brush. The kind of trail that felt forgotten. He liked that about it immediately. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and golden light slanted down through the trees in long, cathedral-like columns. For the first couple of hours, the hike was everything he had hoped for. Other hikers crossed his path occasionally, a couple with trekking poles, a man walking a dog, and they exchanged polite nods before disappearing back the way they came. But the deeper Daniel walked, the fewer people he encountered. And then, gradually, he encountered none at all. The trail ahead of him sat perfectly empty. No voices drifting through the trees, no distant footsteps, no movement at all in any direction. At first, he welcomed it. That was the whole point, wasn't it? But there is a difference between peaceful silence and something heavier, something that presses against you. Daniel couldn't name what changed exactly, but somewhere around the 3rd mile, the quiet stopped feeling like solitude and started feeling like he was being watched. The forest around him looked the same as it had for the past hour. Tall pines, leaf-covered, ground shadows pooling between the trunks. But something about it felt different. Wrong in a way he couldn't quite measure. He kept walking anyway, shaking off the unease the way a person shakes off an irrational thought at 2 in the morning. He told himself it was nothing, just his mind playing tricks on him, the way minds tend to do when they're left alone long enough. He reached the viewpoint overlooking the valley just as the sun began sinking below the ridgeline. The sky burned in shades of orange and violet. It was genuinely beautiful. He stayed longer than he should have, taking pictures, letting the view pull his attention away from the strange feeling that had been following him up the trail. By the time he turned back toward the path, the light was already fading faster than he expected. The forest was swallowing the last of the daylight, and Daniel was still miles from the parking lot. He turned on his phone flashlight and started back down the trail. Beneath the thick canopy, darkness had settled in completely. The beam from his phone was narrow and weak, enough to illuminate a few feet of path ahead, but not nearly enough to make him feel safe. He moved quickly, keeping his eyes on the circle of light at his feet, listening to the rhythm of his own footsteps on the leaves. For a while, that was the only sound, just him moving through the dark alone. Then he heard it. Footsteps behind him, slow and deliberate, matching his pace almost perfectly. Daniel slowed. The footsteps slowed. He stopped entirely, and the footsteps stopped the exact same moment he did. He stood frozen, listening so hard the silence felt physical. Then he turned around and swept his flashlight across the trail behind him. The beam cut through the dark and landed on nothing. Just empty path, just trees standing shoulder to shoulder on either side, their trunks disappearing into blackness beyond the reach of the light. No person, no animal, no movement at all. He stood there for a long moment, staring, before he forced himself to start walking again. He told himself it had been an echo, sound bouncing off the trees in some unusual way. That kind of thing happened in forests. He almost believed it. He moved faster now, more purposeful, his light bobbing with each step. Then he spotted something lying on the ground at the edge of the path up ahead. He almost stepped around it before his brain registered what it was. A backpack, old and weathered, the fabric faded and stiff with dirt, half buried in leaves, as though it had been there for months. Daniel stopped and stared at it. There was no one else on the trail, no voices nearby, nothing to explain how a backpack had ended up here, abandoned at the side of a path that supposedly hadn't been used heavily in years. He nudged it carefully with the toe of his boot. It shifted slightly, but didn't reveal anything. He was still staring at it when the sound came from behind him. A single loud crack, like a branch snapping clean under deliberate weight. Daniel spun around. His flashlight swept the trees in a wide arc, and for just a moment, no more than 2 or 3 seconds, the beam landed on something between the trunks about 20 feet away. A figure, tall and completely still, standing in the dark between the trees, facing him. Daniel called out, asked if anyone was there, if they needed help. His voice came out steadier than he felt. The figure didn't respond, didn't flinch, didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, half dissolved into shadow, watching. Then slowly, and without any urgency at all, it took one step backward and vanished into the dark. Daniel didn't make a decision to run. His body made it for him. The moment that figure stepped backward into the dark, every instinct he had fired at once, overriding logic, overriding reason, replacing all of it with one single animal instruction. Move. He turned and broke into a fast walk first, then a jog, his flashlight swinging wildly with every step. The forest pressed in tight on both sides of the trail. Branches reached overhead like hands. The beam of his light caught glimpses of trees, roots, the pale patch of path in front of him, just enough to keep him moving without falling. For a few seconds, he heard nothing except his own breathing and the thud of his boots on packed dirt. And then the sound came back. Footsteps, not slow and careful anymore. Fast, crashing through the underbrush somewhere behind him, loud and entirely without caution, as though whatever was back there had stopped caring whether he heard it. Daniel ran, properly ran, faster than he had run in years, his heart slamming against his ribs, his lungs burning with every breath. Branches scraped his arms, roots tried to catch his feet. The darkness closed in on every side, and his little circle of phone light felt grotesquely inadequate against all of it. The sound behind him grew louder, heavier, closer. He could hear it cutting through the brush, no longer following the path, moving through the trees themselves. And that detail was the most terrifying thing of all, because it meant whatever was behind him knew this forest well enough to run through it in the dark. Daniel didn't look back. He knew on some deep, wordless level that looking back would cost him time he didn't have. So he just ran, and the trail twisted and turned, and all the trees began to look identical in the bouncing light, and for one horrible stretch of about 30 seconds, he was genuinely unsure whether he had taken a wrong turn. His lungs were screaming, his legs felt like they were filling with concrete. And then, through the trees, somewhere ahead, he saw it. A faint glow of yellow light bleeding through the dark. The parking lot. He drove himself forward one last time, crashed through the final stretch of trail, and burst out into the open. He yanked his car door open and threw himself inside, slammed the lock down, sat there shaking, unable to catch his breath, staring through the windshield at the dark mouth of the trail he had just come out of, waiting for something to appear. But nothing did. The trail sat empty and perfectly still. No footsteps, no figures stepping out of the trees, just the darkness and the quiet, and the feeling that something in there had simply chosen to stop.
Daniel drove home with every interior light in the car switched on and both hands locked on the steering wheel. He checked the rearview mirror compulsively for the entire 40-minute drive, watching the dark road behind him unspool in the red glow of his brake lights. Nothing followed. The road stayed empty. By the time he pulled into his driveway, his heart rate had dropped to something close to normal, but the fear hadn't left entirely. It had just shifted into something quieter, something that sat in the back of his mind and refused to let him write the whole thing off as paranoia. Because he kept returning to the same details, the same questions that had no comfortable answers. Why had someone been following him in silence for that long without announcing themselves? Why stand in the trees and simply stare when he called out to them? And why, the moment he turned to walk away, did they give chase? There was no reading of events that made the figure seem harmless. Daniel turned all of it over and over in his head that night, lying awake, replaying the image of that tall silhouette standing motionless between the trunks, watching him with no intention of being seen. The next morning, still unsettled, he searched for the trail online. He told himself he was just looking for context. Maybe there was a history of strange incidents. Maybe someone else had posted something similar. What he found instead made every remaining explanation he had been clinging to collapse at once. The trail had official operating hours posted on the park's website. Descriptive. It closed every evening without exception before sunset. That alone wasn't unusual. Lots of trails had closing times, but the specific closing time listed on the page stopped him. According to the website, the trail had officially closed more than 2 hours before Daniel had even parked his car that evening. 2 full hours before he stepped foot on the path. Which meant that for the entire duration of his hike, every mile he had walked, every moment he had stood at that viewpoint, every second he had spent running through the dark, the trail had been closed, locked up, empty. No visitors, no authorized personnel, no one who had any legitimate reason to be there. Daniel sat in front of his laptop for a long time after reading that. Because the worst part wasn't realizing that he hadn't been alone out there. The worst part was the thing he couldn't stop thinking about, the detail that settled over him like something cold and permanent. If the trail had been closed for hours before he arrived, then whatever had been standing in those trees had not been passing through. It had been there long before he came, waiting patient and still in the dark, as though it had known he was coming.